Hi, good evening. Is the screen visible?
Yes, sir. It's visible, sir.
Sure. So let me know when to start.
Yes, sir. Just 2 minutes, sir.
Sure, take your time, no rush.
Please make Dr. Gaurang Shah also co-host. Gaurang Shah, sir, you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, but very softly.
Hello, Lucy, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, very clearly.
Can we?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So we have 30 participants. गुड इवनिंग सर. सर आप co-host हो? जीतू सर.
Yes. I am there.
Okay, sir. Sir, we'll wait for 2-3 minutes and then start.
I am fine, Tanvi, no rush from my side.
Okay, sir. Gaurang Shah, sir, Geete sir.
How, how many have joined right now?
सर 36 people है फिलहाल.
एक 2-3 मिनट रुक के शुरू कर देते.
चलेगा सर, चलेगा. Yes, sir. Yes. Sir, well, I just wanted to inform also all the students कि from next Tuesday, that is 6th April, we'll be starting our case presentation. Same time, Tuesday 9 p.m. So volunteers can message me for Viva.
And it is as per the both protocol, current protocol as well as last year protocol.
Yes, sir. Yes. Now I think theory exam is over. We will concentrate on giving practical exam.
Tanvi Pankaj sir and Hiren Soda sir also join.
Okay, sir. I'll just unmute them.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir.
How are you, everybody?
Yeah, fine, sir.
Good, sir. Good to be back after the theory exam.
Yeah, yes, yes.
Can we start now?
Yes, sir. So we can start, sir. Rishi, sir?
Yeah.
So it's almost 50 now. You can start.
Yes, sir. So, Gaurangsha, sir, who's going to introduce?
Gaurangsha sir only.
Okay, sir.
नहीं सर ने किसी को बोला है तो पता नहीं लेकिन पूछ लेगा.
Sir?
Hello.
I think
Mute हो गए क्या?
muted. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Tanvi, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Okay, so shall we start the meeting?
Yes, sir.
Yes sir.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. After I think almost 2 months, we are starting our academic program. And I am very delighted to introduce you Dr. Rushi Deshpande. He is currently working as Director of Nephrology Academics at Jaslock Hospital and Research Center. And also, he is a Director of Critical Care Nephrology at Sir H.N. Reliance Foundation Hospital and is a Senior Consultant Nephrologist at Saifi Hospital, Mumbai. He is a gold medalist in DNB Nephrology and was facilitated by Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, ex-President of India. He is offering honorary services to Tata Memorial Hospital, Mumbai for last 11 years. He has been awarded Times Healthcare Award in 2019-2020 and has been voted by peers as one of the top nephrologists in Mumbai by Outlook and India Today magazine. He will be talking today about the transplant immunology, that is how to select the patients and also the drugs used in transplant. And tomorrow we will have the second meeting where he will talk about the rejection also. So I will request Dr. Rushi Deshpande to start his talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gaurangsha sir, for the kind introduction. It's a privilege to speak to this August group of my urology colleagues, both senior and junior and friends. When Dr. Gaurangsha sir requested me, will you take a talk on transplant for the urologist? I thought it was a very interesting talk. So what I requested, sir, is that give me 2 sessions back to back, and I will try and divide the transplant into 3 parts. One is donor and patient selection. The second is transplant immunology, the drugs used in transplantation, and complications or management of complications early and late post-transplant. This I thought would be relevant from both clinical as well as the exam point of view. So without much ado, let me start. I think I'll go over the transplant immunology first because to a lot of doctors, this is something we need to revise very carefully before we go for any boards. So basically, when you say sensitization, what does it mean? See, how does our body recognize any thing that is not us? So that is 2 main stimuli. One is the innate system and one is the adaptive system. So innate system means it is, what should I say? Anything that is not human can be picked up by the innate human system. whereas adaptive means between the same humans. So now, I mean, innate immunity is common for you and me, whereas the adaptive immunity is to each his own. It's all individualized. Okay. So these are the different arms of the immunity. So based on so this is how a rejection would come place, but we'll go through that in much more detail a bit later. Let us go over innate immunity first. What do I mean by innate immunity, and why is it relevant to transplantation? Because here essentially it's a human to human, right? So when the organ undergoes a process of ischemia reperfusion injury, this is what happens. There is inevitably a small period of ischemia, at least even in living donor transplant, as we all know. The cessation of oxygen supply renders these cells unable to generate sufficient energy to maintain the homeostatic process, which can lead to cell damage or even death. Now, this cell damage or death is associated with release of certain systems which are detected by the innate and adaptive immune system. So principally, it is the innate immune system that is activated during organ reperfusion. So innate system has two arms. One is a complement arm, which involves opsonins, CRPs, complementation activation products, and certain immunoglobulins. And there is also a cellular arm, which would contain the phagocytes, lymphoid cells, and the natural killer cells. Now, this cell damage or death associated signal, they are also called as DAMPs. What is that? Danger associated molecular patterns. They are recognized by these pattern recognition receptors, which mediate the responses. So these DAMPs are basically, ATPs, heat shock protein, etc. Will not get much, but basically understand that cell injury or death signals are recognized by the pattern receptors that will actually mediate the response. These molecules are normally hidden from the immune system or are derived from degradation products of extracellular matrix component generated during the ischemia reperfusion injury and the inflammation surrounding it. This is what would actually happen when there is an injury. So either it could be a classical pathway mediated. I'm sure this is a slide familiar to all of you. So in the classical pathway on the left, it is basically the C1q derived system, which will lead to ultimate formation of C3 convertase. On the extreme right is the alternate pathway, which is spontaneous activation, that's pathogen surface, right? It is not antigen antibody mediated. So this is C3 derived, which gets converted to C3 convertase, or it could be a lectin derived pathway. Ultimately, once the C3 convertase is activated, it will form the membrane attack complex and damage the cell, as we understand. So different kinds of cellular components, epithelial cells, the phagocytes, the granulocytes, as well as lymphocytes are involved in presentations. So particularly if you look at phagocytes, they are involved in phagocytosis, cytokine production, and antigen presentation, and so are the lymphocytes. So these are the important cells when it comes to adaptive immunity. Now, what do we mean by adaptive immunity? It is an antigen-specific response, which occurs mainly. There are two things. There are two arms of the system. What is the afferent arm, which is the signal arm, and the efferent arm, which is the effector arm. So afferent arm is responsible for picking up the signal. So these donor antigens, which like I showed you in the last slide, the lymphocytes and the phagocytes, primarily the lymphocytes are going to pick it up. They are going to get activated, they'll proliferate and differentiate while sending cells for growth and differentiation to a variety of cell types. And the effector arm is the arm where the the response, it's like the army has been mobilized and now it is going to attack. So that is the effector leukocytes, which will migrate into the organ. Here it is the kidney, and the donor specific antibodies which are synthesized. So whether it is cellular immunity or it is humoral immunity. Cellular immunity means the cells, of which it could be the specific cells, the lymphocytes, and as well as leukocytes, or it could be an antibody mediated arm. So that is a humoral part, both of which will ultimately cause tissue damage. Now, in addition to the two basic immunities, we need to understand that ABO group, blood group antigens are important for transplantation. It is important for us to understand that we are not actually transplanting across a blood group identical recipient. We are normally transplant to avoid mismatch of the major blood group antigens. That's what we actually do. You understand the difference, right? We are not matching for every blood group. You know, there are a lot of blood groups in humans. ABO is just one of them. RH type, then you must have seen the others, Lewis, there's that. But we are not actually typing for all of that. What is important to transplantation is the major bloods. So you're looking across the ABO group. And why not RH? Because it is not expressed on the endothelium of the kidney. Now, I have been practicing ABO blood group incompatible transplants for the last 12 years, but that is not the topic of the day. The topic of the day is to understand how the blood group antigens, the ABO group, is responsible for creating problems if you're not matching for those. So when we are born, we actually don't have any antibodies against any blood group antigen. It is only by the 2nd or 3rd year of life that they naturally occurring, as we call them, anti-A or anti-B antibodies will be found in us, depending on what is our blood type. So if my blood type is A, then I will have anti-B antibodies in my blood by 2nd or 3rd year of life. Same will happen for blood group B, will get anti-A in his blood by 2nd or 3rd year of life. And these antibodies, if you're going to not take proper care and remove them before doing across the group transplant, they are strong enough to cause hyperacute rejection and rapid graft loss. Okay, so this is something that needs to be overcome before you plan a ABO incompatible transplantation. Now it comes to the next thing, that is the major histocompatibility antigens. So class 1 and class 2, MHC class 1 and MHC class 2. Now, what are major histocompatibility antigens? So whether it is class 1 or class 2, it is basically, the way I like to remember HLA or MHC, MHA is self from non-self. What is self? Self is everything that has been exposed to our antigen, to our immune system prior to our birth. That is recognized as self. All of you are familiar with the thymus and how during in utero, how it is exposed to antigens. Whatever antigens are exposed to thymus, you develop tolerance and you're not going to cause a problem to them. But whatever antigens have not been seen by your thymus before birth, basically they are what is foreign or non-self. And they are recognized as problems because that is a defense mechanism. It is not developed to hurt your kidney transplants. It is a defense mechanism which is developed to protect you, to stay alive. Okay, so the class 1 is actually a class 1 MHC class 1 proteins are glycoproteins which are on the cell surface. They basically have two chains. One is a beta-2 microglobulin chain, which is the same for all of us. And there is an alpha chain, which is highly polymorphic and encoded by class genes. So they are present on all nucleated cells. Okay, so MHC class 1 is not only on lymphocytes, it's on all nucleated cells. And they are responsible for activating cytotoxic CD8 T cells. The class 2 are encoded entirely within the MHC and they have two glycoproteins. There is an alpha chain and there is a beta chain. MHC class 2 are primarily responsible for antigen presentation. So these are the APCs, antigen presenting cells. Now downstream they are going to activate CD4 expressing helper T cells. MHC class 2 is not across all nucleated cells. It is only on few cells which are antigen presenting cells in the body. What are they? They are the B lymphocytes, the dendritic cells and the endothelial cells, some of them. MHC class 1 can present peptides, but it's not the same as class 2. Okay, so in the class of MHC class 1, the peptides that they present are primarily acquired from the intracellular environment, which are not as important. When it comes to HLA, how we, all of you have seen an HLA typing report. What does it show? It shows HLA-A, HLA-B. C, we don't really do much, but that is how the complete thing would be, HLA-A, B, and C. And class 2 would be DP, DQ, and DR. Now, in kidney transplant, what is important is A, B, and DR. Now you are seeing some reports of DQ antibodies, and some centers have started looking for DQ, but it's not standardized. It's not like standard yet. In bone marrow, all the 6 would be needed to be typed. Okay, so in some organs, they type for all of them. Whereas in kidney, we look for A, B, and DR. And we are not, I mean, it's great to have mismatches, but at least we should avoid mismatches as much as possible. There's a difference, right? So when you say match means same, mismatch means present in donor and absent in recipient. Now that is a mismatch. Okay, understand? So basically the matching could be from 0 to 6. So if it is 6 on 6, that's great, because then the number of medicines required is going to be less. Whereas if it is say anything between 0 and 5, then that's not so different when you look at the Kaplan-Meier curves for survival for different across HLA matchings. Why DR is so important? Because like I said, DR is a class 2 molecule, and antigen presenting is primarily a feature of class 2. So CD4, which is very important, would be activated by MHC class 2 mismatches. These are the 3 signals. Now all of us need to remember that. Whoever is practicing kidney transplants needs to remember the 3 signals for T cell activation. What is signal 1? Signal 1 is the MHC of the host with the digested peptide from the donor coming and stimulating the antigen receptor, the T cell receptor, or the CD3. You can see the red one on the left. That is the signal 1. Now, signal 1 by itself is not so strong. It requires a co-stimulation by signal 2. Now, signal 2 is like in, the kind of, in Guyton, all of us remember how there is a positive feedback cycle. So it is something like that here. So co-stimulation can come up from positive feedback. So the signal 1 going downstream, activating different enzymes, of which the important one from clinical perspective is the calcineurin, which is going to activate the nuclear factor, and that is going to convert the inactive NF kappa B to the active form, which will go into the nucleus and start the process of cell division and replication. So signal 1 in association with signal 2 will activate this pathway much faster. Why is calcineurin important? Because you have a drug to block it. You don't have a drug to block the IKK pathway or the MAP kinase pathway, but you have a drug to block the calcineurin pathway. So signal 1 also combined with signal 2, an activated response, proliferation, and this proliferation, what is formed is the CD25. Now, once the CD25 is released, that is the signal 2. Signal is also, it's an interleukin 2, right? So interleukin 2 and interleukin 2 receptor. Now that once it's activated, that is a signal 3. It is responsible for converting the mTOR and activating the cyclins, which leads to the cell cycle getting activated. And when the cell cycle is activated, then there is proliferation, which is difficult to control. You'll have a whole army ready in a few hours, ready to destroy your kidney. Why is signal 3 important? Because you have a drug to block it again, right? Similac or basiliximab, that is going to act there. Okay, so particularly it's important for us. Why is this so important, this complicated diagram for us? Is because if you look at all the drugs which we will go through, they are going to act at particular sites on this diagram and come to a helping us to block this cycle. So you cannot stop antigen presenting totally, right? So, but once the antigen has been presented, you still want to control the response. Otherwise, the kidney will be destroyed. So once the response goes downstream and there is allograft injury, then you're going to see all these granzymes and perforins, which are the mediators of injury to the graft, and they can be detected in the urine. So they are important because over a period of time, all of us will see that there will be new tests coming up for detecting kidney injury early, particularly the rejection mediated injury, which will be, these are more likely to be the tests because they'll be seen in urine. You may have heard of the word liquid kidney biopsy. So looking at urine and based on the report saying what is likely to be happening in the kidney. So that is this concept. B cell activation is important because B cells are important antigen presenting cells to activate the cell immunity, and also B cells proliferate to become plasma cells, which make antibodies. Okay, so B cells are very effective antigen presenting cells, much much more than the dendritic cells, etc. Because they can clonally proliferate, they can be the numerically dominant antigen presenting cells. And these cells are different from dendritic cells. They just don't present the antigen. They themselves are a part of the effector response, which we went through. B cells can have an immunoregulatory role, but like immunology, there are so many pathways which are both in all directions, both positive and negative. Suppose you have a B cell activation with increased production of interleukin 10, you might actually have a, you will have a tolerance, but that doesn't happen usually. But again, the tolerance mechanism is mediated by the same B cells, which we are talking as if, they are bad. So it is tuning them and not destroying them, which is the key. B cells have a capacity to produce a number of cytokines, of which interleukin 6 is very important. We all know that. Interleukin 2 we spoke about. So B cell production of TNF alpha and interferon gamma can promote the Th1 T cells and macrophage activation. So let me not get too much into the details of this because it may not be very clinically relevant, but understand that all these mechanisms, whether it is direct injury to the endothelium, whether it is binding to the immune cells, or whether it is complement activation, they are all the different mechanisms by which the immune cells actually hurt the kidney, right? So whether it's an immune cell mediated, whether it is a direct injury to the endothelium, or that is complement activation. Direct injury to endothelium is particularly important because, once there is complement activation and there is injury mediated by the immunity, by the antibody, it leaves behind a trace. And this is clinically relevant. What is the trace? Is a C4D, which can be detected much later after the antibodies have disappeared from there. And once you detect the C4D, you can actually go ahead and say that yes, there was an antibody-mediated injury to the kidney. Now, what is allosensitization? Allosensitization means presence of circulating immunoglobulin G HLA antibodies in the recipient serum. Why is it important to detect allosensitization before? Because if there is a response and there is a repeat exposure to the same antigen, you will get what is called as memory response. Memory response is very rapid, very aggressive, and it can cause permanent graft damage. So it is important to look for circulating immunoglobulin G HLA specific antibodies. What are they commonly called as? DSA, or donor specific antibody. They are an effective or incomplete surrogate for detecting the T or B cell memory. Okay. Now, how can somebody get sensitized? How can somebody get exposed even before the transplant to different human antigens? 3 common routes: blood transfusion, pregnancy, or a failed allograft from a previous transplantation. These are the main 3 routes by which you get sensitized. So there was data that showed that if any of us get more than 4 or 5 blood transfusions, the chances of us forming antibodies to other human antigens, non-self antigens, is to the tune of more than 50%. So that is detected by what is called as a PRA, which I'll go through. The different mechanisms of injury, complement detected lymphocytotoxicity. This is, the CDC test. Now, when you look at HLA, this was Terasaki and Patel in 1976, I think they came up with this. What is the idea here? The idea is very important. The idea is you want not to put the kidney into somebody who already has antibody against this kidney. So what are you going to do? You're going to take cells from the donor. You're going to take the serum of the recipient, which may contain the antibodies. You're going to mix them, incubate them. And what are you going to add to the reaction? Complement. Because if there are antibodies attacking the cells, you add complements and you are increasing the response. Then what will you do? You'll add a dye, which is like a vital dye. So all cells which are alive will not stain with this dye. Any cells which are dead will pick up the dye. So this dye, once you put it there, it will show you how many cells are destroyed. You count the number of cells and you can say what is the result. So routinely, anything more than 20 is definitely strongly positive CDC. Anything which is between 10 and 20 is a gray area. Less than 10 is reported as negative. So this is the concentration of antibody in a way. Now CDC, the original one, was not very sensitive. People were transplanting across with a negative CDC and still getting a problem. So what the next test came into being was the CDC AHG. where addition to the recipient donor cells, recipient plasma, another anti-human globulin to potentiate the response, then complement, and then the vital dye. Simple, right? Donor lymphocyte, recipient serum, one anti-human globulin, then the complement, and then the vital dye. So whatever is alive will not pick up the vital dye, will not be seen as red on the microscope. Whatever is dead will be seen as red. So the dead cells you have to just count and multiply and give a number. All of us are familiar with how we count cells in the under the microscope, right? Remember our old days counting RBCs and everything. So you'll remember that. So when you say CDC, it is you're looking for everything. Like when you're looking at cells, you're looking for T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, class 1 antibodies, class 2 antibodies. When you're looking at DSA, so you're getting more and more specific. So if I tell you there is a cross match which is positive for B, what would that mean to you? That there are antibodies against class 2 but not against class 1, because B only has class 1. Whereas T will have both. Okay, so this is how it is seen more diagrammatically, what I just explained to you. Okay, so I'm not going to read all of it again, but this is what I explained to you without the slide first. So when you have these reports, you can look for T cell cross match, B cell cross match separately also by separating the two types of cells from the donor. If both are negative, it means great, you can go ahead and transplant. Both are positive, you can still think, is it an anti-HLA antibody? Is it an auto antibody? Or is it a non-HLA antibody? Why is it important? Because if it's a non-HLA or an auto antibody, then the result is not bad after transplant, right? It's an IgM antibody. So important things for cross-match CDC from the practical point of view is before giving patient drugs like rituximab, you should first do the cross-match. Because once you give rituximab or thymoglobulin, which we don't give ever before, but rituximab we give before, particularly for blood group incompatible, we give it like 2 weeks before, but they can lead to false positive cross matches. So if your patient has a cross match positive when you're screening, then just go through it. Have you got rituximab in the blood? Because if you have rituximab in the blood, anti-CD20 antibody, you are going to cause B cell cross match to be positive. Correct? So that is how you need to think. So the cross match is important because we are all very worried to transplant across a positive cross match. But we know there is a limitation of the CDC. Primarily problem is a low sensitivity and some false negative reports where the DSA titer is low, etc. Because all of us have know that transplanting even with a negative CDC cross match is not a guarantee that you will not have an early acute rejection. You just know that the antibody, if present, is not in a large quantity when the CDC is negative. It doesn't mean anything more than that. What next? So these are techniques to look after the IgM, etc., which either you can just add something called as DTT, that dithiotretol, or by heat modification, and you can get rid of the IgM. That is very specific. Next comes a test called as flow cytometry. Now, what happens in flow cytometry? So CDC, flow, Luminex. You are aware that there are 3 platforms to look for cross match of between the donor and the recipient. CDC, we have explained to you. The flow is the next. Now again, nothing changes. There are donor lymphocytes, there are recipient serums. But here, instead of adding the complement, you are actually adding a second antibody which is fluorescent tagged. Now what is this antibody binding? It is binding against IgG DSA. Right? So this anti-IgG antibody binds to the donor antigen and the DSA complex. So any antibody which is bound to the lymphocytes, the DSA antibody, against that you have added an antibody. And now this will be detected when it flows through a flow cytometer. This is how it would look. How is it important? Because it is much more sensitive and specific. It is more sensitive in that it does not require the complement. So it can detect both antibodies, complement fixing as well as non-complement fixing. Now, if you have a negative flow cross match, the chances of you having a successful transplant are extremely good. You can almost close your eyes and do it without having to worry about an early acute rejection. The flow cross match has a higher specificity than CDC cross match as it detects only IgG. Why IgG? Because only IgG is important in kidney transplant. IgM is not important. Autoantibodies are not important. We are interested in complement fixing, particularly complement fixing IgG antibody against the donors. And that is detected better by flow cross match than by CDC alone. What is the limitation? Because it is so sensitive, it is not telling you whether it is anti-HLA or non-anti-HLA antibody. So pronase to digest the Fc receptor on the donor lymphocytes. Now it is important because if you have a rituximab treated patient, you can add a pronase to the same reaction and the effect of the rituximab goes away. So if it is a false positive cross match, it will go away. If it's a real positive cross match, it cannot go away. Correct? The next test, what I'm talking to you about, is the Luminex or a solid phase immunoassay. There are actually two types. There is ELISA based or Luminex based. So these are like commercial platforms. ELISA is a platform, Luminex is a platform. The solid phase the immunoassay is specific for HLA antibodies. So the false positives that can be seen even with flow cross match are totally removed. It is when it is Luminex positive, it is only HLA antibody. I don't know why these blue lines coming on the screen. The ELISA test is more sensitive than the CDC cross match, while the Luminex is more sensitive than both the CDC as well as the flow cross match. Okay, so Luminex is now considered the benchmark in detecting the immunologically significant DSAs. What is Luminex? So to explain to you, they're like small beads. These beads are coated. Now there are two types. Either it's a single antigen bead or there are multiple antigen beads. So these beads are coated with HLA antigens, which are purified antigens, which are stuck on them. So I mean, it's a very, very lab intensive procedure, but the companies actually make the beads with antigens already on the cell surface. Now these beads are given to us. Now these beads contain the antigen, so you don't need the donor, right? You can actually do a virtual, right? So single antigen means same antigen will be attached to the bead, whereas multiple antigen is less expensive. It has got multiple antigens on the same bead. A single antigen is most precise in detecting DS against a specific antigen. Remember that the MFI values that are mentioned do not directly correlate with the antibody titers, and they can be affected by certain lab parameters like the avidity of the antibody, etc. Why is it important to know the solid phase immunoassay? You got the principle, right, of solid phase immunoassay? Instead of the donor antigen, you are actually getting beads coated with HLA antigens, right? You are taking the recipient sera, you're doing the test. If anything comes positive in the test, then you can actually, with a single antigen bead, you can actually say, oh, this recipient, potential recipient, has antibodies against this human antigen. And if you can say that, what does that mean to you? In the middle of the night, when I get a call, there is a donor available. If I have that donor typed HLA, I can tell you without doing a cross match, am I going to take that kidney or not? Right? So that is what I'm trying to start at ZTCC Mumbai. We are trying to get the donor HLA done in the middle of the night if required, because if we have antibodies on our recipients who are waiting for a transplant, particularly sensitized recipients, then you can actually do a virtual cross match in a computer and say whether or not this cross match will be okay to do a transplant. So this technology is becoming more and more interesting and busy. In the sense, I'll just walk you through a couple of them. So these are some limitations of the solid phase immunoassay, particularly very low titer of antibody or very high titer of antibody, what is called as a prozone, can be missed. Okay, because if antibody is very less or very, very high, then it's difficult to detect sometimes with a solid phase immunoassay. And hence, multiple of tests is sometimes better. I will not bore you with more details. We'll just go over this fast. Okay, C1Q assay, it's even better because if you add a C1Q to a Luminex based single antigen bead, then your sensitivity to detect very low titer donor specific antibody goes up. Right. So what is a virtual cross match? This is important because this can sometimes be asked as a short note also. So one of the biggest technological advances in the field of transplantation is a virtual cross-match. So virtual cross-match means you have a donor recipient serum who are waiting on the list, collected and preserved, and these are run against the Luminex beads. So you know in advance which antibodies are present in the recipient serum. So Luminex based accurate immunological profile of the recipient. So you have this kind of Jalan Kundali sort of thing. You're prepared. These are the antibodies in the particular recipient. Now this is against a computer based model. You can put in what are the HLA antigens in your donor who is donating the kidney, and the computer can very well tell you, doing a virtual cross match. Why a computer? Why not manually? Because there are so many epitopes which will come in the way, and that would be a bit detailed, but just to understand it is best done with the computer, the virtual cross match. Negative virtual cross match in a patient without any history of sensitization, you don't have to wait for the cross match. It's as simple as that. You can minimize the cold time. Positive virtual cross match, please do the flow cross match. Do not reject it directly. Okay, because sometimes a virtual cross match may not be everything. So a positive virtual cross match with a negative flow cross match could be due to low titer antibodies of doubtful clinical significance, and it is considered safe to proceed with transplant if the flow cross match is negative. Okay, so this is basically like historical kind of preparing a chart of antibodies on the patients who are waiting for the transplant. So when there are no donor HLA specific antibodies, organs can be allocated to prospective recipients that have a high probability of negative donor lymphocyte cross-match. These are the different techniques. So this is the technique based on the laser, which is the MFI, which will capture the beads. So this is the Luminex. So these are the different beads. This is the serum. When you add the serum with the antibodies, if the particular antigen is present, the antibodies will bind to it. Then you add the fluorescent dye, and when it passes through the gate, the lasers will detect if the antibodies are bound to the bead or it is not bound. If it is bound to the bead, it will be reported as bound. And that is how your MFI comes up. Okay, so what have I gone through so far? We have gone through innate and adaptive immunity. Then we have gone on to the tests used for transplantation, which is the CDC based test, CDC AHG. Then we have gone to the flow cross match. Then we have gone through the Luminex. Then I explained to you the idea of a virtual cross match. Now I'm going to walk you through the last part, I think, of this, which is a panel reactive antibody. I understand it can be a bit overwhelming if you're not gone into it in much detail, but it is very important for all of us to know this. At least we need to get the concepts right. So what is a PRA? What is a panel reactive antibody? So it is like doing a cross match, except it is not against a particular donor. It's against the local donor population. So you take random, antigens from the donor population. From, suppose you are in Mumbai, you take random donor samples and you form a panel of different antigens in your own lab. And against this panel, you add the potential recipient serum and you see what is the cross match. So a cross match here, the report will be reported as a PRA or panel reactive antibody. How is this important? A PRA is a test for previous sensitization. So if the patient has received blood, if the patient has got a pregnancy in the past, if the patient has had a failed allograft in the past, then they are more likely to have PRA positive. So a PRA more than 20% would be putting them at a high risk of rejection post-transplant, and they would get extra consideration, extra score when they are waiting for a transplant on the deceased donor list. And if a PRA is positive, I do PRA for all my living donors. And how is it important? Because if the PRA is positive, then I'm going to go and do the DSA. Why not DSA on everybody? Because DSA is expensive. PRA is less expensive. So you do a DSA when the PRA is positive. That's what I do. And if the DSA is positive, then that is a sensitized patient with a preformed antibody and he's very high risk of rejection. You should not do it unless you are sure that you are able to desensitize the patient. So desensitization will go on some other day. But remember that PRA is a basic test. You should do it on every patient who is coming for a transplant living or cadaveric. If the PRA is positive, it is a sensitized patient. Take your time to make sure that you have done everything to reduce the make sure that there's no early acute rejection. So whether you do a DSA, whether you do a flow cross match, so many techniques you have now, right? We have gone through them. So panel reactive antibodies is a very old test. It's a very relevant test even today. It's very inexpensive, and you can easily know if your patient who is waiting for a transplant, whether he has or does not have anti-human antibodies. Okay. So why is it 20? Because normally you take 100 blood donors. That's where you get the donor pool from. And then you do the test and then you get the report. So out of 100 donors, if you have antibody against 1, it is PRA of 1. It is never 1 because actually the plate has only 50 donors. So it's already multiplied by 2. So the PRA is always in multiple of 2. Remember that PRA is never in non-even digits. It's never odd digits. It's only even digits. Okay. So the percentage PRA is going to predict the likelihood of getting a positive cross match. But PRA is non-specific. It is not going to tell you whether there is donor-specific antibody or not. So this is what would happen when you do a transplant. So if you have cross-match negative, your chances of having a rejection are very low. Now, if you're going to look at only a CTC cross-match, then your risk of having a rejection will be still higher. Whereas when you do a flow cross-match or a solid phase immunoassay, your chances of having a rejection will be very low in spite of having a DSA. Okay, so that is how it is to be interpreted. Right. So this is how they would compare to each other. So when suppose you have a CTC, you have a flow and a Luminex all on the same patient. Now how are you going to read the reports? So suppose Luminex is positive, flow cross-match is positive, and CTC is positive. Now that is an unacceptably high immunologic risk. Do not do this transplant. Okay. If you have a Luminex and a flow positive, but CTC negative, the risk is there, but it is not unacceptable. You can consider doing rituximab plasma, some desensitization, and doing the transplant. If it is only Luminex, but flow and CTC are both negative, it is a low risk. You can consider doing, but it's not zero. It's not like a standard. Whereas when all of them are negative, it is a low risk transplant. Then you don't even use an induction, you are fine. Get me now? So you can go ahead without an induction therapy in such cases, if everything is negative. Okay, so I have tried to walk you through the transplant immunology in a very brief, concise way. I'm sure there could be a lot of questions. I'm going to walk you through the donor and patient evaluation today. The drugs, depending on how much time we have and how tired all of you are, you can tell me whether you want me to take today or tomorrow. And because there are 3 topics left, donor evaluation and selection, patient evaluation, these are actually brief. Then the drugs are important for all of us, and post-transplant course is also important. Now on the immunology, if we have any questions at the end of today's session, if Gaurang Shah sir allows, then we'll take those. Okay, I would really want all of you to understand the transplant immunology, because the rest of this you can actually read from books. Transplant immunology is one thing that you may get confused with, where you may need somebody to handle. So at the end of this session, if Dr. Gaurang Shah is okay, we'll take the questions. Now going
questions in the end.
Yeah. So
We have, you don't worry, we have got enough of time. You will get tired. Our students will not get tired.
Well, so you know me. Okay, so we'll go through the donor evaluation and selection. So this one table is telling you everything. Now people come to me and ask, can I be a renal donor? You know, when I did older donor transplant, Gaurang Shah sir may remember, this was in Jaslok in 2009, early 2009, late 2008. It was a 76-year-old donor. And the Human Organ Transplant Act, if you have read through it, it covers donors from 18 to 75. So it was the first 76-year-old donor in the history of our country. And I was not able to get a permission because it was not falling under the HOTA. So I had to actually get a special permission from the office of the DMER, because they were not sure what to do with the 76-year-old. So we had to actually go and say, no, chronological age and biological age are not the same. Please give us a permission. And we did this transplant. It is still working 13 years later. But that's another story. So who can be a donor? What are the criteria of being a donor? So I always tell them, what I tell the donors is that, see, listen, my responsibility is towards you. I am not going to allow you to become a kidney patient in the future. So I'm going to do every single possible test to ascertain A, you will not have any adverse outcomes early after the operation of kidney donation. Second, you will not become a patient with chronic kidney disease, symptomatic at least, because your GFR will drop to 60, right, or 70 after the recovery phase, but you will not get any signs of kidney disease through your life that we can visualize. And last is that donor should not have any infections which they can, or malignancies or anything like that, that they can, unknowingly pass on to the recipient. And the last and most important thing is, let us do all the immunological workup to be sure that transplant is successful, because as you all know, most patients of ours get only one shot at getting a successful transplant. So what are the important things in the donor? Right from history, ask the donor, is there any family history of renal disease? Sometimes you have a donor with 5 to 6 RBCs, but suppose that donor has a family history of Alports. Now that becomes a difficult thing, right? So important to know whether the donor's family had any history of kidney disease. A detailed health questionnaire, donor education, because a donor is a healthy person in the community. We should be sure that we have given them all the knowledge before they go ahead with a consent. And the transplant nephrologist and surgeon are equally important in deciding the medical and surgical fitness of the donor. Also, a psychiatric evaluation of the donor is very important. Ideally, the person who is actually going to transplant, suppose I am going to do the transplantation, it's my patient, I should not be involved in assessment of the donor. Now that is what is ideal. In most Western countries, you will find that the donor evaluation is not done by the transplant teams, period. Why? Because there's a conflict of interest. But in our country, right now, it doesn't hold. So the same person who is going to conduct the transplant also does the donor evaluation. So it is upon us to ensure donor safety. Because it is not that only the patient is ours and the donor is not ours. It's a healthy person coming to us. It is very responsible of us to make sure the outcome to the donor is not bad. Now, what is that you look for in a donor? You look for your routine tests. You make sure that the donor is non-diabetic, non-hypertensive. Borderline hypertension we have taken, but then these are extreme cases. We'll not discuss that right now. GFR assessment, either with a 24 hours creatinine clearance, or most of our patients actually get a DTPA scan now. And why is that? Because you know the individual function of each kidney. Rather than just knowing the total function of the kidneys, if you know the individual function, you will always leave the better kidney for the donor. Okay, suppose it is 50 and 45. I would want for 50 left for my donor. Right? HbA1c may not be enough if there is a strong family history of diabetes, and you should consider doing an oral GTT. Metabolic workup, if there is any past history of kidney stones in the donor. A blood group typing, so complete blood count, metabolic panel to ensure that patient does not have any other significant illness, liver enzymes, coagulation studies, urine analysis, rule out UTIs, cardiac evaluation, cardiopulmonary evaluation like for any other major surgery is important. Then comes your immunological typing and cross-matching, all that we spoke about just now. Infections, screen for HIV, hepatitis B, C, syphilis, tuberculosis. And in endemic areas, look for specific things. We don't look for West Nile, but that would be in Africa, they would look for it. The next most important thing to us is rule out malignancies. So specifically based on the age recommendation criteria, in males, you would do a PSA. In females, you would always want a gynec exam, a pap smear, colonoscopy. We don't routinely practice, but in donors above 60, you should consider at least a stool occult blood ×3, or if there's any suggestive history, then consider a colonoscopy. Mammography, we don't routinely do, but unless the breast exam is positive with the gynec evaluation, but again, that is part of the recommendation. Pregnancy test is a must in all females with childbearing age. From the lung function, you do a PFT. From the heart function, you do an ECG, echo, and a cardiac stress test. Okay, because make sure that your donor does not get any cardiac event peri-op. Then last comes the imaging of the kidney with a renal angio and a CT scan. MRI, normally we don't do unless patient has allergy to the CT dyes. You just do a classic, a regular CT. So basically, what have you done with all these tests? You have ensured the 3-4 objectives that I said when I explained to the donor. That the donor will not become a kidney patient, that the donor will not pass on inadvertently any malignancy or infection to the recipient, that The operation should not be high risk for the donor, and you have done everything, because most of us will get only one chance at a successful transplant. So all the immunological tests possible required have been done. You don't have to do everything for everybody. You need to, that's when you take the detailed history and you receive the logistics, you know which one to do for whom. So less than 18, you are not supposed to take. So it's interesting, because is it 18 or 21? And one of our colleague nephrologists recently asked me this question. And less than 18 to 21 is actually a gray zone when I tried to find out more about it. A donor with a history of substance abuse should be rejected. Diabetic donors, avoid. There are some relative contraindications and some absolute contraindications. Like a donor with, suppose, an active kidney disease, IgA, I mean, you would not even think of it, ADPKD, or a donor has some active illness like hepatitis B, HIV. We're not talking extreme cases, but the routine part, any malignancy, any bad heart disease, just avoid them. And see what I told you, relative, 65, that is the age for most programs when I spoke of 76. So borderline or control with single agents for hypertension, obesity, BMI between 30 and 35 is borderline. Create clearance, again, that is in the Western literature, it is all above 90 is normal. In Indians, there are studies from PGI and from AIMS which have shown that GFRs between 70 to 80 are common for a lot of Indians, which are otherwise healthy donors. So if your donor has no proteinuria, no hypertension, normal sized kidneys, no family history of kidney disease, no past history of UTI or kidney stone significant, and he has a GFR of say 84, is that abnormal? Actually, as per the Indian data, it is a normal GFR. Okay, so all those criteria, blood pressure, proteinuria, all those need to be looked at, right? This is the donor. Okay, so the recipient, I will not put a slide for the recipient, and you know why? Because anybody who is on dialysis should get a transplant. Which is the only recipient which I would not transplant? If the recipient will not likely survive for more than 5 years post-transplant, I would not transplant. Because no donor organ should be wasted, whether it is from a live donor or a deceased donor. So if the patient has some disease which is likely to kill him before 5 years, whatever disease, whether it is a malignancy, whether it is a bad cardiac illness, whether it is HIV, whatever it is likely to kill the patient in less than 5 years, do not waste a kidney transplant. If you think your patient will live more than 5 years, that is at least the rule of thumb that I use, then I would consider getting for a kidney transplant. And a recipient, whatever the risks, for the cardiac risk, you go ahead and modify, do risk modification, whatever you can for the cardiac risk, and do the transplant. So in a recipient, you modify the risk and you do the transplant. In a donor, you don't try to modify the risk. You say no. Don't make them at risk of becoming a patient with kidney problem later. There is a difference between the two. Hence, for the recipient, I have not put up any slides, because like I said, once you know that you have a kidney failure which is irreversible and progressive, and you are stage 5, you are a candidate for transplant. And what is the best time for transplantation? Before you start dialysis. There is enough literature all over the world that preemptive kidney transplants do a lot better than kidney transplants after starting dialysis. There is no reason to wait for your patient to start dialysis before you transplant him or her, because the benefits of having a kidney transplant before initiation of dialysis are significant. Okay, so that is the best time to transplant. Okay, I think next we go on to the drugs. Okay, everybody with me? So now we are going to talk about the different drugs available in our basket when we are going ahead with the transplant. Now, what are we trying to do with these drugs? Just think for a minute. What are you trying to do with these drugs? You know the immunity, how it worked. The innate immunity is not important except during the cold ischemia reperfusion. So in clinical practice, it is not as relevant. Adaptive immunity is the main thing that you really want to inhibit or block so that your kidney does not get rejected. The holy grail is getting something like a tolerance, which is not practically possible as of now, where you don't need any drugs and the kidney is working fine. But as of now, that is not possible. So as of now, what is possible is a functional tolerance, which means that on amount of drugs that the patient can tolerate without major side effects, you suppress the immunity enough to maintain the transplant and avoid opportunistic infections. So how do you manage a transplant? It is a tightrope walk. On one hand, you overdo what you want to do, and you will land the patient into infections and malignancies and diabetes, etc. You do less than what is needed, and your patient will have a rejection. So that is what I call as a tightrope walk. So these are the different drugs available to you. So the immunophilin binding drugs, when you saw, all of you must remember and go back to the figure signal 1, signal 2, signal 3, because that is where most of these drugs are going to help come and act. So the calcineurin inhibitors, the two important ones in practice, cyclosporin and tacrolimus. So cyclosporin is a cyclophilin binding drug, and tacrolimus, also called as FK binding protein or FKBP, is a drug which is again a calcineurin binding. There's something called as a modified release tacrolimus, which is once a day tacrolimus. Then the second drug is a target of rapamycin or the mTOR inhibitors. Sirolimus is the old one, everolimus is the new one. mTOR is after signal 3 into the cell cycle. Right. Inhibitors of nucleotide synthesis. So cell division requires nucleotides. All of us know cell division requires nucleotides. So there are purines and there are pyrimidines. So when it comes to blocking the purine synthesis, there is specific and non-specific. The non-specific is azathioprine, which will come below. Antimetabolite it will fall in because it blocks both purine and pyrimidine synthesis. Whereas when it comes to pure purine, you primarily, the drug we use is mycophenolate mofetil. It comes as a regular drug or it comes as enteric coated mycophenolate mofetil. Enteric coated is called as mycophenolic acid or the active drug. What is this drug? It's an inhibitor of inosine monophosphate dehydrogenase. Mesoribine is not available in our country. It works similarly. It is available in Japan. Pyrimidine synthesis is basically, so that's dihydroorotate dehydrogenase. So the leflunomide, which we are using a lot in practice now, and I'm sure all of you have seen it, leflunomide is actually an anti-rheumatoid arthritis kind of a drug. But the advantage of this drug is that in patients with BK virus, we switch from mycophenolate to leflunomide. So that's how we have a lot of patients now on this drug. FK778 not so available. Sphingosine 1-phosphate receptor antagonist or FTY720. It went out of practice primarily because of sinus bradycardia. It was causing a lot of bradycardia by activating the sphingosine receptors in the atrium. It was not supposed to do that. It was supposed to work in the bone marrow, but it was doing that. And that led to the demise of this good drug. Then there are other drugs, which are protein drugs, which they're like the depleting antibodies. Now, broadly speaking, your drugs will be divided into induction drugs and maintenance drugs. Induction drugs are the antibodies. Now, what are the different antibodies you have? You have polyclonal antibodies, which is like a antithymocyte globulin. The rabbit antithymocyte globulin is what we commonly use in practice. Horse, we don't use much because it is very erratic in its response. Anti-CD3 antibody the muromonab, we used to call it OKT3. It was quite strong. We don't use it so much because the rabbit ATG does all that it was doing, and it's not as bad when it comes to use. Anti-CD52 antibody, also called as Campath or alentizumab, it's not available yet in our country, but it is a good induction agent. So anti-CD52 is present on all lymphocytes. And there could be B-cell specific antibody like rituximab, which is an anti-CD20 antibody. So you see, it is getting into the era of immunosuppression, which is tailored to each patient's needs. So you have drugs against T, you have drugs against B, you have drugs against T and B, you have depleting, you have non-depleting. Now what is non-depleting? Non-depleting is your anti-CD25 antibody. And this is what I showed you when I showed you the signal 3 in the picture. Anti-CD25 antibody, which is the basiliximab. Daclizumab is no longer available. It was kind of been withdrawn. It was similar. Basiliximab is humanized. Daclizumab was less humanized. Basiliximab remains. Similac, which is a Novartis drug, which we use for induction. It is very good. It is a non-depleting antibody, so lesser side effects than the ATG, but also ATG is more potent. That is what we find. Then fusion protein, the CTLA4 Ig, which is, A good drug, not easily available. What is available, what is not shown here is your belatacept, which is a co-stimulation blockade, which was a signal 2. And IVIG, which is quite a non-specific, but it is, it has primarily anti-B, but also anti-T and non-depleting. These are the different induction agents that you have in practice. You have a polyclonal drug, you have a monoclonal drug, you have an interleukin-2 receptor antibody, and you have an anti-CD20 antibody. So B cell, signal 3, or your cells which are just going to, that's like carpet bombing. You put an ATG or an ADGAM. ADGAM is horse ATG, right? So this is like carpet bombing. You just destroy the lymphocytes which are there in the circulation and buy time till they repopulate, right? So why induction agents? Why should you use induction agents at all? We use induction, it's like malignancy. You know how in chemo, in oncology, they always use induction followed by maintenance. And what has been observed that when you use induction followed by maintenance, the amount of maintenance drug required is lesser. So the cumulative toxicity of the drug actually goes down. Also, it is like considering that, once you achieve the result, then maybe you can get away with lesser immunosuppression. So the maintenance is always less than the out at the outset. So now it is written here, high risk patients ATG is given, low risk patients basiliximab can be used. Do you remember what it is, high risk and low risk? How did they know who is high risk and who is low risk? This is why I explained so much in transplant immunology, even though it was becoming the repetition of sorts. So any patient who had a sensitizing event like blood transfusion, pregnancy, failed previous transplant, they are sensitized patients. And how do you classify low risk and high risk? Based on the PRA or the panel reactive antibody test, which I showed you. Anything less than 20 is low risk. Anything more than 20 is high risk. Now understood why we are looking at induction agents. So you will use a more potent, more destructive agent in high risk to reduce the risk of rejection early post-transplant. And in low risk, you will go with a non-depleting antibody because you don't need something that strong. And why would you use induction in low risk? You can go ahead without induction, like I showed you a classic scenario, no DS, no sensitizing event, no CDC normal, flow cross-match normal, solid phase immunoassay normal. Very low risk. No induction, fine. But if you can use induction, patient can afford, give it. Why? Because you can go with minimization of steroid, you can go with low calcineurin inhibitor, because there is data when we go through specific drugs we will discuss, but the Australian trial with the simultaneous pancreas and kidney transplant, it basically showed that at 10 years, the amount of calcineurin toxicity was 90%. When they were doing serial biopsies in these patients every 6 months, they actually saw calcineurin toxicity in more than 90% of the patients. So what that showed is that we cannot just go ahead and use the high dose calcineurin in everybody. So calcineurin is both cyclosporin and tacrolimus, correct. So rituximab is used as B cell depleting antibody in the EBO incompatible transplant 2 weeks prior to transplant. So, when I do an EBO incompatible transplant, like I told you, we don't have antibodies at birth against blood group antigens. We usually form them during the second year of life and later. The titer goes up. Suppose I am blood group A, I have anti-B antibodies in my blood and I'm getting a kidney from a blood group B donor. Now I have antibodies, so it's not going to work. So what can I do? I have twofold strategy. One is I'm going to use a drug to reduce the production of this B cell antibody, anti-B antibody. So antibody means B cell. Clonal proliferation of B cells, plasma cells, they make antibodies. You give a drug like an anti-CD20 antibody and you deplete the B cell synthesis of antibodies, your anti-B titer, the new production has gone down. And to remove what is already present in the blood, you do plasma exchange. Either you do a plasma exchange or you do a immunoadsorption, depending on the cost. But you remove the antibody which is already circulating in the blood. And when your titer of the anti-B antibody has fallen to less than 1 in 16 or 1 in 8, you can go ahead and transplant. So these are different scenarios for induction agents in today's practice: high risk immunologically, low risk immunologically, and immunoincompatible transplants. Okay. Maintenance immunosuppression. Maintenance immunosuppression means long term. Usually in clinical practice as of today, in the last 20 years plus, it's all 3 drug combination. So low doses of 3 drugs has been found to be the best or available immunosuppression to maintain long-term good graft outcome. So what 3 drugs you will use? You'll use a calcineurin inhibitor, you'll use an antiproliferative agent, and you'll use steroids. Steroids, even though steroid avoidance has been spoken about so much, the risk of steroid avoidance is an increased risk of acute rejection by almost 10%. So in our subcontinent, where the second transplants are very, very uncommon, I personally am not a big fan of this. Even though there are benefits to steroid avoidance, I prefer going to a very low dose of steroids like 5 mg of prednisolone on long-term follow-up. So low dose of CNI, low dose of steroid, and good dose of MMF seems to be a very good combination as of now, because it has a good safety profile and the risk of rejection is much lower. Okay, now we'll go through the individual drugs. Okay, so anti-thymocyte globulin. So basically, this is thymus produced lymphocytes, so which have these CD or the cluster differentiation markers on their on the cells. So this is injected into the rabbit or into the horse, depending on which ETG we are using, and the antibodies that are collected from the peripheral circulating blood, which contains antibodies against all these CD markers which are shown above. CD2 is present on all nucleated cells. CD3, both B and T cells. CD4 and 8 are mainly T cells. CD2 and 19, 20 are B cells. So the multiple mechanisms ATG will have. It can work via complement-dependent cell lysis. It can work by opsonization from the antibodies, or it could work by cell-mediated phagocytosis. Because it is so potent, there is a severe first dose reaction, particularly if your patient already has antibodies and you are injecting antibodies against these antibodies, or you have activated cells, then the cytokine syndrome is severe. It can present with fever, chills, arthralgia, hypotension, peripheral vein thrombosis is common, anaphylaxis. So these are very important initial side effects of using a drug like thymoglobulin. So you will always pre-medicate with something like antihistamine, antipyretic, and a small dose of steroid, or you will actually ideally follow the ATG after your dose of steroid has gone in to minimize the first dose reaction. Now, what are the common problems in practice are these: the low platelets and the low WBCs. So how much of this medicine to use? So the common, the recommended is 1.5 milligram per kilogram, alternate day 5 doses, or daily 4 doses. In our practice, we hardly end up using more than 2 doses, because in our population, the risk of the leukopenia, like it comes in much faster, and the thrombocytopenia, and they really take a long time to go. Particularly if you're using MMF in conjunction with ATG, the risk of having low leukopenia and thrombocytopenia is even worse. So an absolute lymphocyte count less than 0.1 in the CBC is a marker that you have done enough and you can stop. So when you look at your CBC, you look at the ALC, the absolute lymphocyte count. If it is less than 0.1, you're done enough, you can stop. The long-term complications would be infection, and very long-term would be something like inducing a PTLD, or a post-transplant lymphoproliferative disease. I already told you this. The next drug in the basket, the depleting antibodies, is Campath. So Campath is a humanized rat monoclonal antibody against CD52 cell antigen. Now, where is CD52 exposed? Where is it presented? It is on all T cells, all B cells, all natural killer cells, and monocytes. So, it is like, it is so potent that it is going to cause depletion of all of these cell types for a very long period of time. So actually, in the initial studies with Campath, they showed rejection that was actually by the mononucleus, not by the mononucleus, but by the polynuclears. like the neutrophils and monocytes, rather than the T lymphocytes, because the T lymphocyte population was depleted for months together. It can also be used in very severe steroid resistant rejections. So it's a good drug, but you need to learn how to use it. Cytokines, similar to what we just said, hemolytic anemia and thyroid diseases are important. Basiliximab or Similac, which I spoke to you about. This is a chimeric antibody. It's a human and a mouse chimera. It's a monoclonal antibody. It is against the interleukin-2 receptor alpha chain, also known as the CD25 antigen, which is expressed on the activated T cells. So this will prevent the interleukin-2, which is the cell proliferation signal, from binding to the interleukin-2 receptor by competitive antagonism. So basiliximab is going to go and bind to the interleukin-2 receptor. So when interleukin-2 is released, there is nothing to bind to. And because there is nothing to bind to, it is going to inhibit T cell proliferation and it will cause apoptosis of these cells where it has bound to. But there is no depletion of T cells. So T cells are not able to proliferate, not able to differentiate, but they are not like wiping out the T cells. So this we explained already. ATG is used for high-risk patient and basiliximab is option for low-risk patients. Few adverse events are noted with basiliximab. There could be hypersensitivity. Now, see, it is a matter of degree, what you need to understand. It is not absolute. It is not that basiliximab has no side effects. Please do not get me wrong. It is less toxic as compared to ATG, but it has toxicity. I mean, if it works, it is potent, it has to get side effects, right? But the first dose reaction is not as bad. Hypersensitive reactions are not as bad because it is not depleting. So the lymphopenia, the leukopenia, the thrombocytopenia is not significant, right? Whereas the risk of infections over a long period of time, it is less with interleukin-2 than with ATG, particularly the CMV and the BKV. The risk of malignancy is again more with ATG. But again, ATG is more potent. You are using it in high risk. If you use basiliximab in high risk, it might not be enough to prevent rejections. So remember, what is potent will also have side effects. Learn to use them well. Teclistamab is no longer available, but it was actually a pure, it was like completely humanized antibody against CD25. Okay. So there were some worldwide reports of inflammatory brain disorders and it was withdrawn after 2018. Rituximab I spoke to you. This is a monoclonal antibody against CD20, which is present on all B cells except for plasma cells. Where is it used? It is used in antibody-mediated rejections. It is used in ABO-incompatible kidney transplantations. And it is also used in desensitization of human leukocyte antigen sensitive patients. So patients who already have DSA and you need to transplant them. How are you going to transplant them? One of the drugs used in desensitization regimens all over the world is rituximab. Side effects of rituximab: infusion-related fever, chills, hypotension, tachycardia, and joint pains. Long-term, the CD20 cells can really take a long time to replete. Even in the spleen and other reservoirs of these CD20 positive B cells, and all B cells are CD20 positive. You can see that they have been depleted significantly for a long period of time. So leukopenia, neutropenia, and low production of immunoglobulins. So hypo or A-gamma globulinemia can be a serious side effect. It's important to look for there should not be any IgA deficiency when you use the rituximab. Remember that one thing. You should always do a serum IgA before you give rituximab, because in a patient with IgA deficiency, you can see anaphylaxis with rituximab. Please remember that. Okay. Now coming to the maintenance drugs. What is the oldest drug that we have in kidney transplant? Steroids. They are there since 1960 and they are still there. Why? Because they have a significant effect on T cell proliferation, blocking interleukin-2 production. They do everything. They also prevent induction of interleukin-1 and interleukin-6 genes in the macrophage. They are also anti-inflammatory. They work the fastest. That is why in cell-mediated rejection, you use steroid high dose, because they have anti-inflammatory effect as well as they work immediately. Okay, so the anti-inflammatory effect, they inhibit the migration of monocytes to area of inflammation. So steroids do a lot of things. How we use steroid? In our practice, we use methylprednisolone pulse on the day of the induction or the day of the transplantation, and then we give post-transplant 1 mg per kg on day 1 and taper it. Maintenance dose at the end of 3 to 6 months usually is 5 to 10 milligrams, which I am in favor of continuing lifelong, because stopping steroids has resulted in a few cases of graft rejection, which is not insignificant. Side effects of steroids, we can write a full chapter on that, right? The important ones are diabetes post-transplant, growth retardation in younger children who are going for a transplantation. Bone disease is very important, particularly avascular necrosis, a nightmarish scenario when you do a transplant. If somebody has an AVN, then God help them. Lots of issues. Other side effects, particularly in younger patients, Cushingoid facies can cause a lot of social acceptance problems. And interestingly, in one of the questionnaires that was given to transplant patients, and they were said, okay, fine, you are allowed to stop one drug without losing your kidney. Which one would you like to stop? So all of them were on different drugs. Someone was on cyclo, someone was on tacrolimus, someone was on MMF, azathioprine, steroid, rapamycin, whatever. 85% of them said we wanted to stop steroid. That is how much the transplant patients hate steroids. But they are good. They prevent graft rejections, and we use them. We just have to learn to use them well and use them in lower doses. So the main side effects: diabetes, bone disease, growth retardation. Others are hyperlipidemia, obesity, Cushingoid facies, poor wound healing. Like I said, cataract is almost universal in our transplant recipients. So ophthalmologists are our great friends because we have so many cataracts to take care of. Hypertension, very important. Psychiatric disturbance. Now in patients with a past history of psychiatric illness, it becomes very challenging to do a transplant because of this. Cataracts, like I said, it is very common. Pancreatitis, yes, very important, because if you have pancreatitis, then using steroid is a challenge, using MMF is a challenge, using azathioprine is a challenge. It's a challenge to transplant patients with chronic pancreatitis. Skin changes because of steroid, and last is peptic ulcers. Actually, with the PPI that we use so commonly in practice, this is not so much of a problem, but the others are very much of a problem. So steroid side effects is a short note. We must know to write all of them very carefully. Okay, so the next drug we'll go to cyclosporin. Cyclosporin, when it came in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, it changed the picture of kidney transplant and made it extremely acceptable. It was only after cyclosporin came into the market that transplant was visibly better than long-term dialysis. The whole data that transplant patients live longer than dialysis patients and that transplant patients have a better quality of life as compared to dialysis patients only comes after cyclosporin was introduced into the transplant population. This was a big game changer in kidney transplant. And this drug made it possible for kidney transplants to survive for very long periods of time in most of the patients. It was only after this drug came into the market that doctors were able to transplant without worrying too much about the HLA matching. So we owe a lot to this particular molecule. How does it work? It is a cyclophilin affinity. So it binds to the cytoplasmic protein cyclophilin, and this binding enhances the affinity of the cyclophilin, and it leads to inhibition of calcineurin. So this is a calcineurin inhibitor. It binds to cyclophilin, and because of this, it inhibits the calcium. Now, what is calcineurin? So calcineurin is an enzyme which we are inhibiting. It is a serine phosphatase. And what is the function of this serine phosphatase? Serine phosphatase is necessary for converting inactive nuclear factor of activated T cells to an active factor. The NFAT, as we call it, the nuclear factor of activated T cells, needs to be dephosphorylated to be converted to the active form of NFAT. This active form of NFAT, when it enters into the nucleus, it leads to cell proliferation. Remember, cell division and cell proliferation are the mechanisms by which the effector arm of your adaptive immunity is going to cause injury to your transplant. That is what you are trying to block. So again, what does cyclosporin do? It binds to cyclophilin, which leads to inhibition of calcineurin. Okay, And what is calcineurin? It is an enzyme. It is a serine phosphatase, which is important. And the normal job of the serine phosphatase is to convert inactive NFAT to active NFAT by dephosphorylation. So if you block calcineurin, this inactive NFAT cannot become active NFAT. So the T cell signaling is blocked. Okay, downstream pathway, the effective pathway of your adaptive immunity is blocked by this single drug. The NFAT, in association with other transcription factors, it initiates the downstream events leading to T cell activation. CNIs or calcineurin can also suppress the immune response by calcineurin independent pathways, like by blocking intracellular signaling pathways specific for T cells. How do we use it? We use it usually is commonly used as a twice-a-day dose with the microemulsion Neoral, which is in use now. For 2000, this Sandimune was used, which is no longer used because it was inconsistent in results. Dose normally, the dose of calcineurin cyclosporin is between 5 to 10 mg per kg twice a day, and we actually go by managing the cyclosporin levels in the blood, which are easily available. So previously, before 2000, we were using the trough levels or the C0 levels to monitor the cyclosporin, and the level in the early part of the transplant used to be between 150 and 250. And late, after 6 months, 1 year, we used to keep it between 100 to 150, 200, not more. But then, after Athol Johnston's work, it became very clear that C2 is a much better reflector of the area under the curve, and the world shifted to measuring C2s for monitoring cyclosporin activity. And from there on, cyclosporin has been used as Neoral twice-a-day dose with C2 monitoring to know what is the dose to use. Sir, if you want to stop me, please tell me. We can continue from here on tomorrow. Dr. Gaurang Shah, if you feel that we should stop and take questions, please tell me. We can take the rest tomorrow.
Just 1 minute. I think he's not able to unmute himself. Just a minute.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Tanvi, shall we finish this and then go tomorrow only for a rejection and other thing?
Yes, yes, sir. So how long is this topic now?
Sir, we have a few drugs to cover. Let me just see. No, I think this is important, sir. I think we can go slow on this.
Yeah, okay.
It was asked for us in exams, actually.
And these are all questions.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I think, sir, it's better that we go slowly over this and not rush.
Okay.
So tomorrow we can restart from the drugs again, go over them, and then go into the complications.
Okay, sir.
So particularly if there are any questions related to immunity, the immunology of transplant, feel free to ask.
So there are 2-3 questions in the chat box. Dr. Vipul is asking if the recipient is sensitized in the last 3 months.
Yes.
The SPI or virtual match still be effective?
Yeah. Now it is interesting because how long, the real question that I think Dr. Vipul wants to ask is how long after the event of sensitization will the antibodies form to the level where they will be detectable. So normally it will take 2 to 3 weeks for the antibodies to be produced in sufficient quantity to be detectable by our standard methods. So like I said, there is something called as a prozone effect, where the antibody concentration is too low or too high. Our current methods of testing for the antibody may fail because of the prozone effect. 3 months is fairly long, and at 3 months you would expect our current methods for detection of antibody to pick up. The problem comes if you get a sensitizing event like 2 or 3 weeks prior to transplant, because then you don't know whether to wait or carry on as if it's a non-sensitized recipient.
Okay, sir. Got it. So the next question was from Dr. Vikas. Is diabetes mellitus an absolute contraindication for kidney donation?
Very good question, Vikas. Now, see, in kidney transplantation, or for that matter in medical practice, the first thing we take oath is do no harm. So ideally, yes, allowing a donor with diabetes to donate a kidney, while we fully understand that being diabetic makes that particular donor at a high risk of becoming a patient of CKD in the future, it is an absolute contraindication. That being said, there are case reports where people have taken diabetic donors, but those are usually with the best intention, where they've exhausted all other possible donors, and it's a desperate situation, and for whatever reasons that they find acceptable, like an old mother to a son, where the donor may not have more than 10 years of life expectancy remaining. And you can always argue that not every diabetic is going to become a CKD if it is well controlled. So, I mean, you can use all of those logics to convince yourself that you are not really harming anybody. I mean, of course, at the time of transplantation, you need to be sure that there is no microalbuminuria. There is not even an early sign of chronic kidney injury in the donor. Doing all that, can you potentially take a donor, like I said, with explained written consent in a language that all of them clearly understand? And when your heart feels good about doing that transplant, when you are sure that you are doing it for greater good, only then you feel free to do it.
Okay, sir. The next question is from Dr. Arshad. If the donor kidney has a stone, then when do you treat that stone before the kidney is taken for donor retrieval, and by what method should we preferably treat it?
That's more of a surgical question, so maybe you guys can take it better than me. From a metabolic point of view, what I would be interested in that the donor should not form stones in the other kidney that I'm leaving behind. So whatever metabolic workup I can possibly do to avoid renal calculi formation in the donor, I would want to get into that. Patients with a history of kidney stones or with an active kidney stones are essentially borderline donors or marginal donors, as we call them. They should be taken with an appropriate informed written consent before you go ahead with the act of taking the donor kidney. What is the best method of removing the kidney, the stone from the kidney, or whether you should leave it alone? Usually it's a surgical prerogative, and I'll let Gaurang Shah and Hiren Soda and the other senior urologist in the meeting to answer that.
So, can you answer that, sir? What method would be preferable and when to treat before the donor?
Yeah, usually if the stone is small, then we'll prefer nowadays RIRS, because that is a preferred method. But there are cases where we have done even a PCNL, and usually it is better to wait for at least 6 weeks after this procedure, minimum of 6 weeks, because then the chances of getting too much of adhesions and all are less.
Okay, sir. The next question is from Dr. Rohit.
I think Hiren wanted to add something there, Tanvi?
Hiren?
Just for the PGs, out of the 2 kidneys, whichever has the stone, preferably that kidney should be transplanted.
Absolutely.
A normal kidney with the donor, and we should try to avoid taking a kidney which has got a very large stone burden. Like sir said, PCNL is a possibility, but again it creates a scar, and so if the stone load is not very significant, then probably he's a good donor. It should be not a very significant stone load, because again in the transplant kidney also he's got a tendency to form stone again and again.
Okay,
yeah, Dr. Gite, you want to add something?
Tanvi, you can mute sir, unmute sir.
So actually he's co-host, so
Okay.
now
I was not a co-host, so that's why I thought maybe.
I mean, from my side, what I can add, sir, here is that the stone travels with the kidney, and I think all of us would agree with that.
Right.
So a stone forming tendency of the kidney is not dependent only, it's dependent more on the kidney than on the environment in which that kidney is placed. And we often see that if there is a past history of kidney stone in the donor, then the recipient kidney is at an increased risk of stone formation than otherwise.
Yes, sir. Okay, sir. So, Geete sir, any more? Anything more?
No.
Okay, sir. So there's one more question from Dr. Rohit. How to select the donor's kidney, like right or left, depending upon relative function and GFR?
So like we all agreed, leave the better kidney for the donor. And unless you have a very difficult situation, like you have a marginal difference between the GFRs, and one of the kidney has 3 arteries and 2 veins, but it has like a slightly higher GFR, then you'd still want to leave that behind because of the technical issues.
Correct.
But the rule of thumb is to leave the better kidney for the donor.
And so is there any like difference in function? Like if it is more than that much, then we prefer not to use
See,
that patient as a donor. Like if the difference in the split function is more than 10 or 15%, then we don't.
see, any kidney with a GFR of less than 40 should be looked upon with suspicion.
Okay.
Because you want to know whether, if somebody has a donor GFR in one kidney, say 35 and 50 in the other, then that 35 GFR kidney may be deceased. You need to look for the renal artery. You might want to look for other factors, any CPN in that kidney, any reason why the GFR is low. And you need to be absolutely sure that it is just a chance and no medical problem before you take that kidney out for transplantation.
Okay, sir. Dr. Sagar's question: do we have a tool for determining life expectancy after end-stage renal disease sets in?
No, we don't. That being said, in patients on dialysis, in data from the UNOS, it has been clearly shown that there is a 20% mortality per year on dialysis if you're a diabetic, and the longevity on dialysis is approximately a half-life of around 10 years for other populations. There are exceptional survivors who make 20 years, 30 years, but those are exceptional survivors. By and large, 5 years into a dialysis unit and 50% of the population has changed.
Okay, sir. And sir, I have one question which we were asked in our exam. Extended criteria for donors, for kidney donor.
Yeah. So way I would answer that question is extended criteria. I would divide the answer in 2 formats. One is for deceased donors and one is for living donors. In deceased donors, a lot of things are acceptable, which may not be acceptable in the living donor. In the living donor, the basis I would use to answer that question is do no harm. So when I'm looking at extended donor, is extending the age beyond 65 and indicate extended donation? Yes, it is. So anything that is marginal, so extremes of age, then a GFR of less than 90 or 45 in the individual kidney, then any history of a kidney stone disease in the past, any morbid obesity of between 30 and 35 BMI, all of them would fall under that risk factor index where you're using an extended donor kidney. Even anatomical things like a duplex ureter or more than one renal artery or more than one renal vein, they'll all fall in the marginal criteria.
Okay. Yes. So that's no questions. Gaurang sir, Geeti sir.
Yeah, no. Only thing is that if any questions are there, if anyone wants to ask, even in the next session of about the first part, they are always welcome. So tomorrow when we are going through this part 2, that time also if there are any questions about this presentation, you can ask.
Definitely.
Group. So I'll address it in the beginning before we start tomorrow.
Sure.
Okay. So Hiren.
Yes, sir. So, on behalf of all of us at the organizing committee and the consultants present on this forum and the PG students, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Rishi sir. I think no words are enough to show the efforts that you have put in. I think it will really make a difference to our students. And every day with you, we just learn a little more.
The pleasure is all mine. I mean, I'm happy that all of you are giving me this opportunity to interact with all of you. It's really a great experience. Thank you so much.
Tomorrow we look forward to the
Yes,
next marathon.
we'll meet tomorrow at the same time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night, sir.
Also, reminder for Tuesday, for all the participants, from Tuesday, 6th April, we are restarting the case presentation. So please volunteer. Message and I'll give you all the topic and then we can start our case presentation from Tuesday.
I'll sign off if that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye. See you tomorrow. Bye.
See you.
Bye, sir. Good night.
Bye. Good night. Good night.